I have been so lucky to call both Chicago and New York home at different points in my life. And one of the most common questions I get is, what are the key differences between these two cities? Chicago and New York are both rich cities and great places to live, but they definitely offer different lifestyles, cost of livings, cultures, weather, and we're gonna get into all of that and more in this Chicago versus New York City deep dive. Hello you guys! This has been one of my most highly requested videos since I've moved to New York this year. So I figured what better time to film it than right now. It's a cozy evening. I got myself a nice little throat coat tee, which is the theme of my fall. I'm in my New York studio apartment and let's talk all about Chicago versus New York City. I moved to New York City this April. So it's almost been like 5 or 6 months living here, which is crazy. And before that, I lived in Chicago for 3.5 years, but I was in Evanston before that for 4 years because I went to Northwestern, go Cats, woo. I obviously know Chicago pretty well. New York, I've visited a bunch. I've had friends that have lived here for years and family, so I feel like I know the city better than like the typical person that has lived here for 6 months. But take all of this with a grain of salt because this is just based on my experience in the two cities. I'm not a native to either one of them, even though I have independently lived as an adult in both of those cities. I'm not from Chicago, I'm not from New York, I'm from Louisiana if you're curious. And my experience is just like very unique to me. My background, my lifestyle, I was working a corporate job in both cities as a young 20-something girl. That will color my thoughts about both of those cities from that unique lens of my experience. So take this with a grain of salt. This is just a fun little video to share what I think the differences are. I really enjoyed living in Chicago. I'm a little biased towards New York because I do prefer living in New York, but I will be objective about both of the cities. They're both great cities and they're both great places to live. I would recommend living in both of those places just for different reasons, depending on what your goals are, what your personality is, and what you're looking for, what's feasible for you financially, what lifestyle you want to have. Hopefully, if you're deciding between the two cities or if you're just curious what it's like, this gives you some insight to help you decide. If you have any more questions, I'm an open book. Let me know down below. Always welcome to DM me on Instagram. I also have a bunch of Chicago vlogs from the past like 3 years on my YouTube channel if you want to check those out for really what it was like when I was living there. And then obviously I live in New York now, so I'm vlogging that. And I don't think I introduced myself, but hello, I'm Lucia. Welcome. Welcome. I'm 25. As I said, I live in New York now. This is my studio apartment. I live alone. It's so much fun. I work a 9-to-5 in advertising. Yeah, it's a great time over here, so subscribe if you're new. And let's get into everything. Okay, so I have a bunch of topics that I want to go over, and I also asked you guys on my Instagram for specific questions. And I'm gonna try and cover everything. I have a lot to scroll through here. We're gonna do the best we can and get to everything. I'm gonna go over cost of living, culture and vibes, people, which includes a lot of different things: public transportation, neighborhoods, safety, cleanliness, food. Specifically, since I'm gluten-free, I got some questions about the gluten-free food options too. Dating, stereotypes about each city and if they're true or not, greenery and nature vibes, sense of belonging, and just a few random questions. So that's everything that I'm gonna be hitting on in this video. Let's start with cost of living. I don't think it's a secret. New York City is so expensive, so much more expensive than Chicago, in my opinion. There's ways to do both cities that are really affordable. You can have 5 roommates in New York City and live in Brooklyn in a walk-up apartment and, you know, not spend that much money on rent. Or you can be like me and really want to live alone in a doorman building and spend an insane amount of money on rent every month. So you can really choose your own pathway with this in terms of cost of living. And I just immediately got into rent. That's the first thing that I think of that is the biggest difference in terms of cost of living. And I'll get into other stuff too, but first we're talking about apartments and rent. And I'm not even gonna touch on owning a place because I haven't really thought about owning a place in either city, but it's definitely just more expensive in New York in terms of the fees that you have with the building. But going back to the rent situation, for Example, when I was living in Chicago, I split a 1-bedroom apartment with my boyfriend at the time. The total rent for that place was $2,400 a month for a 1-bedroom. I paid like less than half of that. It wasn't in a doorman building, but it was a luxury building. It had a gym, it had a bunch of amenities. Doorman building are just not as common in Chicago as they are in New York. I feel like doorman building you can find in pretty much every neighborhood in New York because people really like that culture aspect of living in New York and having a doorman. And also packages get stolen all the time if you don't have one. For reference, that was what I paid in Chicago. Now for this, my studio apartment is $3,000. So a studio is way more than a 1-bedroom in Chicago. Like if you wanted to go find a 1-bedroom, I was looking at paying upwards of like $5,000, which is why I was like, okay, no, there's no way I'm getting a 1-bedroom for myself. I'm gonna be fine with just a studio. The rent difference is astronomical when you compare Chicago to New York, especially for what you're getting for your money. Because I know people that pay about $2,400 just for a bedroom in a 3-bedroom apartment that they share with other people and have roommates. That's 1 bedroom in New York versus that's like your whole own apartment to yourself in Chicago. So the cost of living in terms of rent is very, very different. I am paying triple the amount of money on rent as I was in Chicago. So that's the biggest thing. And New York also has this special little fun thing called broker's fees, where you basically just have to shell out thousands of dollars just to get an apartment, and that doesn't go towards rent. It just goes towards this thing called a brokerage fee, which is super duper common in apartments in desirable neighborhoods. So it's just, there's fees left and right. It's so much more expensive living here, but you can be thrifty about it if you want to. Food. I have noticed that restaurants are more expensive in New York City. I think the first weekend I was out here, I got an entree and a cocktail at dinner, and I think my bill was $60, maybe $65. And in Chicago, I feel like that would be $40 because the cocktails are just cheaper, the entrees are just cheaper, and it's like maybe $5 here, $5 there, but it adds up. Food is definitely more expensive in New York City. I feel like that's not a secret either. Groceries though, I haven't really noticed a difference in that. I think they're pretty comparable. New York City maybe has less budget-friendly grocery store chains versus Chicago has a bunch sprinkled in there that are more accessible. So maybe groceries can be a bit more of a premium in New York City, but personally, my grocery budget has stayed the same. Workout classes, oh my goodness. If you do any of those chain style workout classes like Orange Theory, Solid Core, Berries, they're gonna be more expensive in New York. Your monthly membership for the same amount of classes or a class pack or whatever the package is that you're choosing, there's gonna be a surge pricing in New York City. They just make it more expensive here. I guess because there's more demand. I don't really know why. Maybe it's just a cost of living, or the rent is more expensive for the workout studios here, so they have to charge you more per class, but the packages that you're gonna get at workout studios here are gonna be way more expensive than they are in Chicago. My workout classes budget definitely had to increase with moving here. Taxes. The New York City tax is more than Chicago. With taxes, I don't have the exact percentage off the top of my head, but my taxes did increase with the move here by a significant amount of money. That's how it is, but at the same time, it's like your taxes are going to the city that you're living in, and that's just how the world works. Okay, I got a specific question. Since I transferred offices and kept the same job from Chicago to New York, I've mentioned that I got a cost of living increase with that. I got asked, what was your cost of living salary adjustment, and do you think it's been accurate? My base salary increased about 6%. Do I feel like it's comparable to how much more I'm spending now that I live in New York? No. I spend way much more money than that. I mean, I tripled my rent price, and I've increased things that I spend in terms of workout studios. I don't spend a ton of money on going out to eat because luckily as like an influencer, I get invites for that, and it's just not something I prioritize as much. Just overall with like the biggest expenses that I have every single month, that cost of living salary adjustment that I got at my full-time job, while I'm very grateful for it, it did not cover the full extent of how much more money I'm spending now. But at the same time, in Chicago, I was splitting a 1-bedroom apartment. Now I live alone. Obviously, that's gonna be a huge difference in cost. If I really wanted to, I could have kept the same budget, or maybe just like increased my budget by that 6%. But there were just certain things that I was willing to pay a premium on, because in Chicago, I was living under my means, And now I feel like I'm just kind of living in accordance with what I'm making. Still saving money, but just saving less money than I was in Chicago because I was really just making way more than I was actually spending. You can do it here for cheaper. I just haven't. But for me personally, no. I definitely spend more than that, like 6% increase. Like my budget has gone up more than 6% for sure. I feel like that covers cost of living. Now moving into the culture, the vibes, the people, the fashion, the theater, the concerts. The people are very different, I've noticed. New Yorkers get a bad rep for being mean. I think the difference, the big difference between Chicagoans and New Yorkers is I think Chicagoans are nice and I think New Yorkers are kind. I don't think New Yorkers are very nice. People are in a hurry, people are on the streets, people aren't gonna give you the time of day, but once you really are like with someone in New York and talking to them, I think they're very kind. I think in Chicago, there's much more of that culture of the Midwestern hospitality, so people might be nice in that they'll like open the door for you or whatever, but maybe they're not as kind. I mean, I met so many kind people when I was in Chicago. It's like a generalization of just kind of like the people that you see out on the street, if that makes sense. And also just in general, in New York City, there's so many more transplants. It's so common to just meet someone that's not from the area at all, not even from the East Coast. You kind of expect that. There are a ton of East Coasters. Just like in Chicago, there's a ton of Midwesterners. But proportionally, in Chicago, there were so many more Midwesterners than there are East Coasters in New York City. Chicago has more of that local feel. I feel like a lot of people are in Chicago because they have ties there. And in New York, people just become attracted to the city through work or through whatever. Like it brings so many people in from so many different backgrounds and interests and careers that you just meet so many more different types of people in New York. Just from like my interactions, it seems like a more diverse city. New York City really attracts people not just all over the nation, but all over the world to come move and live here. So I think that could be why too. There's so many different scenes in New York, but Gossip Girl, if you guys have seen it, such a good show, such a classic. It's really true. There are those very elite, sceney parts of New York and people. There's that whole subculture here. I mean, you're kind of either a part of it or you aren't. I feel like I've had some exposure to it and it's very true. There's like a level of disparity in New York, if that makes sense. I feel like in Chicago, there's definitely wealthy people, but it's not so, okay, Gigi Hadid is like walking down the street now, or, you know, billionaires and millionaires coming to town and just like super elite circles and social clubs and everything. I feel like that's less prevalent in Chicago. It's more low key. And in New York City, I mean, there's just celebrities. There's so much more elitism here, a lot more wealth that you see on a day-to-day basis. So Chicago is just more chill in that regard. That actually is a great segue into the fashion thing because with that, there's so many more designer clothing here. Just walking down the street, you see so many more designer bags, designer clothes, people wearing really, really nice stuff that I didn't see so much in Chicago. I also feel like in New York, people take more fashion risks. It's just less cookie cutter. People are wearing like all sorts of types of things. Chicago, I feel like every girl was just wearing the same sort of outfit in like the places I would go and the bars I would go. In New York, definitely there's themes that you see with people, but people definitely get a bit more avant-garde with their fashion and more creative with it, which I think is really fun. You see a lot more people wearing heels in the office, particularly with office wear fashion. My Chicago office was so chill. People would wear sweatshirts to work. It's very common to just wear jeans and New Balance sneakers and then maybe some sort of bodysuit or top or something very low key. And in New York, in my office, hardly anyone really wears sneakers or jeans. It's a lot more elevated. It's a lot more sling back heels, kitten heels. It's just a different aesthetic in that way. So that was a big fashion difference that I've noticed. People are just dressed up more and people wear a lot more heels here. Theater. The Chicago theater scene has a special place in my heart because they have some really great professional theaters there. I love Chicago Shakespeare, Looking Glass, Steppenwolf, even like the Broadway in Chicago that brings in a bunch of touring shows. It really is a fun place for theater, but you just can't beat theater in New York. There's a million celebrities on Broadway as we speak. I saw Eddie Redmayne, I saw Idina Menzel, I saw Sutton Foster all in the same week. The theater scene here is just unparalleled. I mean, it's the theater capital of the world, I feel like. And there's so many shows happening, so many groundbreaking new theater. There's everything under the sun. I mean, theater is just amazing here. It is more expensive. There's ways to get around it. You can rush. So I think theater here is very accessible, very fun. I'm very into the theater scene here. It is better in New York. But I will say there were a couple shows this season on Broadway in New York that premiered in Chicago first. The Notebook the Musical and Illinois at Chicago Shakespeare. So there's still cool things to see in Chicago, but you're just not seeing everything. Like, not everything that was on Broadway premiered in Chicago, but some stuff will. So you still get good theater in both cities, but New York is the best for theater because I mean Broadway. Concerts. I feel like the concerts are very comparable. I think all the big artists pretty much on their tours go to both Chicago and New York. There's not a big difference. I think maybe there's more special events in New York. Obviously we have the award shows. Billie Eilish had her listening party here. Artists will do kind of more special shows in New York, but I think the concerts are pretty comparable. Museums, there's definitely a much larger variety here in New York, and also just so many more museums because there's 5 boroughs worth of museums and gardens and things to see. I feel like in New York I could never see all of the museums, but after 3 years living in Chicago, I feel like I kind of made the rounds and pretty much knew all of the museums super well. So there's just a lot more in New York. Sporting events, I feel like there's nothing like Chicago sporting events because it almost has that small town feel where everyone is super into it and the city kind of revolves around its sporting events in a way. Cubs games are so much fun, so cool. Everyone goes to a few a year. And I feel like in New York, since there's just so many more things to do besides sports, people aren't as into it. It's less embedded in the culture. And even though Chicago sports teams aren't even the best ever, I feel like people just have a lot of spirit for them, which makes it really fun. So I went to Cubs games. I never actually made it to a Bears game. I wanted to though. I went to the hockey, the basketball, White Sox, baseball too. The sporting events in Chicago were really special and fun things to do. And I'd love to go to sporting events in New York, but again, I think maybe it's just a bit more expensive here because it's New York and so many celebrities are in attendance at these games, but it's definitely less of a huge cultural thing in New York. So that's definitely a different vibe here. In terms of making friends, I think it's easier to make friends in Chicago because I think people are more chill, people are more open, people prioritize their friendships more in Chicago, just as a generalization. In New York, it's easy to meet a bunch of people out and about, but people are just so busy in New York. I think one part of it is that you're on the East Coast, so you're close to a bunch of other places where you can quickly take a weekend trip. I feel like in the summer, it's such a sort of thing that people say that New Yorkers are never in town in the summer, on the weekends especially. People are always out of town. And I think that's just because New York is so centrally located to other parts of the US where it's really easy to take a train to Boston, to Philly, to visit your family on the shore, to go to the Hamptons or something. And in Chicago, you just have less options for things that are really close by. I think people in New York are just busier, so it's really hard to make that time to really make friends in New York, if that makes sense. Moving on to public transportation, subway versus CTA. Oh my God, you guys, I could talk about this for hours. The subway is one of my favorite things about New York. It is not perfect, but just compared to the CTA that I experienced in Chicago, the subway is a million times better. I'm obsessed with it. There's so many lines, they're always running, they're always crowded, so you don't feel eerie and you're just by yourself on a train and feeling like a bit unsafe, because honestly that's how I felt so many times in Chicago because people are just not as out and about as much on the trains. So after 9 p.m. in Chicago, the train is like super empty and I just feel a little sketch being there and I don't feel really safe as a young woman. But in New York, the trains are always crowded at any time, pretty much any time before midnight. I feel comfortable going on the train by myself. There's always people around. The trains are always running. They're not running super late. They're pretty timely. I mean, sometimes they're late, but it's not like you're waiting at the station for 20 minutes and then the train still isn't there and then you're like, okay, well, I guess I'll just call an Uber now because I'm already running 30 minutes late at this point. I could talk about this for ages, but the subway is 10 times better in terms of its reliability, its flexibility, the wait, the lines, the ways, the routes, everything about it, I love 10 times better. I have had some gross experiences on the subway. A guy sneezed on me once, which was very, very disgusting. And people people can be crazy on both Chicago and New York public transit systems. I think that's pretty comparable in both cities, but just in terms of the actual transportation part of it, the subway is better. The walkability of New York City is so much better. You can truly walk from the bottom to the top of Manhattan if you wanted to. Obviously, it's just gonna take you a long time, but I feel like in Chicago, there's so many highways and things kind of in the middle of neighborhoods that makes it really hard to walk anywhere you wanna go. And in New York, I get so many more steps a day in. It's the best thing ever. And it's just more convenient in general. So I feel like in Chicago, I was always having to Uber. And in New York, I barely Uber unless it's just like 1 a.m. and I just feel safer doing it. But for the most part, I take like no Ubers here and it's the best thing ever because I just can rely on the transit system. I also got a specific question about commuting with that. So I did spend some time whenever I was living in Brooklyn commuting during rush hour on the subway. You are packed like sardines. It's not pleasant, especially in the summer, but the trains are consistent. And I feel like I never had to wait on a train too long. In New York, I don't have to plan out when a train is coming based on when I'm leaving. Like I just know if I get to a train stop, the train that I want to get on will be there within 5 minutes. Like I don't even have to check. In Chicago, I really had to plan 45 minutes in advance and check and see what time I needed to leave to make sure that there's gonna be a train there. And it was just like this whole like mental gymnastics thing you had to do in your head in Chicago. And you just don't have to do that in New York. It gives you so much more peace of mind because you just know that a train will be there within a few minutes and you don't have to worry about planning for when the train is gonna come. With commuting, a lot of people do just walk to work. If you have that luxury, if you live close enough to your place. I reverse commute since I work in Hoboken. So I'm headed to New Jersey and it's the best thing ever because there's no traffic. I'm the only person on the train sometimes. It's the best. Neighborhoods. The neighborhood difference between the two cities is honestly really hard to compare because in New York, it's just so much bigger. For reference, the New York City population is 8.3 million people. Chicago population is 2.6 million people. And I think Brooklyn alone is like 3 million people. And that's within New York City. I think those numbers are right. Please fact check me. New York City is just so much bigger than Chicago, so it's hard to compare the neighborhoods because Chicago is just smaller in terms of land and also people. In New York, there's 5 boroughs. They're also different. I spend most of my time in Manhattan. I've also been in Brooklyn a lot. Queens is also up there. It's pretty popular. There's a bunch of cool neighborhoods there. And then there's Staten Island, which is low-key kind of far away, but I have spent a fair amount of time there as well, just before I moved to New York. And then, what's the other one? Oh, the Bronx. Oh my God. You guys are like, girl, are you sure you're qualified to make this video? But yes, the Bronx, which I haven't actually spent a lot of time in. So there's so many neighborhoods I haven't explored in New York, but just from the ones that I have explored or have friends that live in Chicago, all of the neighborhoods are pretty similar. They all have the same chains. And I mean, the same case in New York for the most part. I mean, they're all gonna have your basic chains, workout studios, etc., grocery stores. But I feel like the vibes of the Chicago neighborhoods are a bit more similar. You have your more alternative areas like Wicker Park, Logan Square, which maybe would be more comparable to places in Brooklyn like Bushwick or Bed-Stuy. But even then, I would say those places in Brooklyn are probably even more alternative and artsy than those places in Chicago. I feel like Chicago's pretty mellow with that, just because there is so much more independent artists in New York. And the Chicago neighborhoods are really cute. I think they do just all have a very similar vibe and aesthetic. And in New York, there's so many different types of neighborhoods with every vibe you could think of. And people are really spread out. There's families, there's young professionals, there's elderly people, there's everyone under the sun's in like every single neighborhood, I feel like, because there's so many different types of buildings, high-rise buildings, luxury buildings, walk-ups, penthouses, whatever, in a bunch of different neighborhoods. People in New York truly live just everywhere. But I feel like they have those TikToks, those maps that kind of show where the Chicago neighborhoods would be in relation to New York. And I think those are very accurate. So I would check out that if you're curious for like the different neighborhood vibes and how they're similar or different. Safety. So I got questions about which city I feel safest in. I'm gonna preface this by saying I luckily had no safety issues in either city since living in either of them. I think a part of that is just like I'm very cautious. So just as a message to all of you, they're both big cities where crime does happen. Crime happens everywhere though, not just in these big cities, but crime does happen there. You have to stay alert, especially when you are on public transit or walking around by yourself, wearing headphones or whatever, especially at nighttime, but really any time of day. It's important to stay alert. I really try to be cautious of that. But I will say, just from a general vibe standpoint, I do feel safer in New York just because there's so many more people out and about. I feel like Chicago sometimes for me could get kind of eerie. People hibernate more, maybe because it's cold, I don't know. But there were a few times in Chicago where I felt like I had to Uber to be safe. And in New York, I don't really feel that as much just because there are people out at all hours. So you never feel alone and like, oh, if something happened, no one would ever see you because no one's here. You feel a bit safer just because you're surrounded by more people. So generally, I feel safer in New York. Cleanliness. Okay, I feel like this one is not a secret at all, but Chicago definitely wins in terms of cleanliness. New York is dirty. It is borderline disgusting at times. You know, it's very dirty. There's a lot of air pollution. There's a lot of cigarette smoke in the air always. There's a ton of fumes just always going around. It's a dirty city, and Chicago is known to be pretty clean. I think whenever I do go back to Chicago, I'll probably be like, whoa, it is so clean here. And I feel like a lot of people have that experience when they're traveling from New York to Chicago. I think a big reason is because Chicago has alleyways where they keep their trash in dumpsters. New York does not. The streets feel narrower in New York and the sidewalks feel narrower, and there's no alleyways to put the trash, so the trash is always just out on the sidewalk, and that just contributes to a lot of smell. And the rat situation. I actually got a specific question about rats. I have not encountered a rat since being in New York City. I know that must be crazy to hear, but I know friends that have encountered rats that have gone over their feet, and they're definitely there in the city. Okay, wait, actually I take that back. I feel like I did see one rat on the street once when I was eating, and I lost my appetite. But I also have seen some in Chicago. Chicago is definitely cleaner for a lot of reasons just related to how the city is set up with its infrastructure. But also New York, it gets hotter here in the summer. With that, I feel like it just gets smellier and grosser. And there's also just more people out and about in New York, which, you know, makes things less clean because there's more people, more trash, more litter, and that's just how it is. You just take a couple showers a day and you're good. That brings me to weather, actually. So weather is very, very different in Chicago versus New York, in my opinion. I will talk about the summers and the winters. We'll talk about everything. So we'll start with the winters. Chicago winters are really intense, really awful, really windy. That's a stereotype about Chicago, is that the winters are tough, and they are, I'm not gonna lie. I really struggled in the winters in Chicago because there's not a lot of daylight. It really does get freezing. There's multiple days where it's under 0 degrees. You just feel like you can't really do anything. And the wind chill is really what gets you, I feel like. And there's more snow and everything. New York, from what I've heard, the winters are really not that bad here relative to Chicago. I think sometimes you don't even have to wear your parka. There's less like sub-zero days, and it's just a bit more manageable. So that I'm really excited about. Spring. So I was here for spring in New York this year. It was so beautiful. It was pretty rainy, but it was nice weather. I think in Chicago, the spring's kind of fake. It's just like a long extended winter where it's still in the 30s and 40s up until like May. And then you're like, okay, finally we can have like some semblance of spring, but then it's time for summer immediately. So winter, spring, not the best in Chicago, but summer in Chicago is so beautiful. It's like 75 degrees, 80, 85 degrees. There are some hot days thrown in there, but for the most part, because of the breeze you get from Lake Michigan, the vibes of summer are glorious. It's not very humid at all. Compared to New York definitely gets hot. There were days where it was 100 degrees, and then when you're just like in the subway, a lot of people don't have air conditioning. It can get a lot. I think that's why a lot of people escape the city in the summer. I personally really liked it because I'm used to the heat, being from Louisiana, so the summer didn't bother me. But the summers here are definitely known to be pretty hot, and it also is pretty humid here in the summers, which I was surprised about. The fall, oh my god. I'm so excited for New York City fall. I think it's gonna be the best ever, and then it's just so fun because then you get into the holiday season, and I feel like New York gets super decked out with that. The fall is pretty nice in Chicago too, just a little bit colder and a little bit more daunting because you're like, winter is coming. But in New York, I feel like it's more chill because you're not dreading the winter as much. So pretty much both of the cities have all 4 seasons, so you're gonna get a mix of everything, but I think New York is a bit better when it comes to weather for me personally and my likes and dislikes, because I can handle the heat and I'm not too big on the cold. Okay, food. Oh my God, that's making me hungry. Got a question about how the food scene is different. I honestly think they're very, very similar. I think Chicago has amazing food options. It's known to be a foodie city, and New York has such amazing food options too. I think New York has more options just because it's bigger, so there's more restaurants to choose from, but they both have a ton of fine dining options. I think New York has even more fine dining options, and as I said, the restaurants are probably more expensive here, but a lot of the popular places have opened up in Chicago now. Like there's Planta, there's Olio e Payu, a bunch of restaurants have opened up in both cities, like the Smith, different places like that. I do feel like New York has a lot more fast casual chains that are specific to New York, which I really like. There's a million Cavas, a million chains everywhere, which is very convenient, but there's fun places like Springbone, The Little Beat, my little like health food type restaurants that I like. I feel like there's more of that in New York and more diversified everywhere in a bunch of different neighborhoods, versus in Chicago I feel like they were a bit more, you know, only in specific areas. But Chicago does have fun chains like Goddess and the Baker and stuff, so I think the food honestly is super comparable. You're not gonna go hungry in either city. You're gonna have plenty of options, so many diverse cuisines, fun places to try, Michelin level restaurants, more mom and pop style restaurants. You really will get both in both cities. I don't think you're gonna be missing Chicago food when you're in New York or vice versa. Gluten-free options, in terms of that, I think both cities are very comparable. They both have amazing gluten-free options at most places I wanna go, and I haven't struggled with that. New York does have better bagels. There are more bagel options here, which is nice, but I feel like that's to be expected. It's kind of like a New York thing. Pizza. I got a question about Chicago versus New York pizza. I feel like this is a huge thing, and I know I'm gonna get some testy comments about this because I feel like people get very passionate about Chicago versus New York pizza. But I'm gonna go out on a limb and say, I think Chicago pizza is better. I'm a deep dish gal. I like the culture of the pizza in Chicago. I think it's really fun. I think the New York style pizza is a lot more just pizza by the slice, and you just kind of grab and go. It's a little bit greasier. They have less gluten-free options with the pizza here. You can't really get like gluten-free slices. It's not the same vibe. They definitely have a lot more late night pizza places open in New York where people go out and then they'll grab like a slice of pizza, which is fun for people, but that's just not really my vibe and I can't even eat that. So I'm a Chicago pizza gal. I love, you know, sitting down, indulging in the pizza, taking it out on a picnic, and I love deep dish. I think it's great. I think it's so good, and I have a special place in my heart for Lou Malnati's because I worked there in college, and it's just so good. So yeah, I'm a little scared that I shared that opinion. I feel like people are gonna have thoughts about this. Let me know actually what you think about Chicago versus New York style pizza, and this is your sign. If you're in Chicago, go to Lou Malnati's and try their deep dish. Tell them I sent you. Dating. Fun question. I feel like dating is pretty similar between the two cities. I think the modern dating world is just very dating app heavy, especially with people in their 20s. Chicago, definitely pretty much most of my friends that got boyfriends while living in Chicago, they met on a dating app. Same with literally everyone I know in New York. That's how you meet people, is on the dating apps. So that is very similar between the two cities. I do think the vibes are different though. I think the boys in Chicago seem a bit nicer and more laid back and wanting to settle down. I think it's just that Midwestern feel. And I think New York, since it's more of a hustle culture vibe, just wanting more and more and like being very more financially motivated. Obviously, these are big generalizations. I think New York has a stereotype of a bunch of guys being like in their 30s and 40s and still not being willing to settle down and wanting situationships and stuff. I personally haven't really dated in either city. I was in a long-term relationship when I lived in Chicago, and dating is just not really like my thing. I'm not really into the dating apps, so I haven't dabbled too much in dating in New York, but just the vibes of what I've gotten from hearing about it from my friends and people and culture. I think also in New York, since people do have that hustle culture mindset, I think people are a lot more intense about dating here. So many people will really hustle on the apps and schedule 4 dates a week and really dedicate to just meeting as many people as possible, making it a numbers game, really trying to push themselves to go on as many dates as humanly possible, which is a little overwhelming for me, but that's definitely a culture here. I didn't feel that culture as much in Chicago. I feel like it was more like, oh yeah, I'll go on a date this week, maybe a couple this month. It wasn't so much like, okay, gotta line up, gotta get my roster. So I feel like that is a bit different. I know I said that the guys in Chicago maybe were more down to earth-ish, but I also think they're a bit more fratty. And again, this is just a huge generalization. There are nice guys in both cities, I'm sure. There's also probably assholes in both cities because there's just people of all kinds everywhere. And you can find your people in whatever city, but these are just huge, huge generalizations of what people tend to say. I also think just in general, Chicago has more of a relationship vibe to it. People are more coupled off there and live together. I think in New York, it's less emphasis on longer term relationships and more people focus more on their careers and maybe just wanting something a bit more casual. But again, a major generalization. Greenery and nature. This is a fun question. Both of the cities have a lot to offer in terms of greenery and nature, in my opinion. Obviously in New York, there's Central Park. I love Central Park, but it's kind of far from me. I've only been maybe twice since I've moved. So it's there, but unless you live super close to it, you're not going to be able to utilize it all the time on a daily basis. So it sounds lovely to live close to Central Park and get to go on a walk there every day and have that real nature feel where you're surrounded by greenery and trees. But I don't really experience that. That's maybe once every couple months I experience that. But for the most part, I'm in a concrete jungle. And I think same with Chicago. There's a bunch of small parks sprinkled out in a bunch of different neighborhoods in both Chicago and New York. And there's a bunch of big parks in New York and all the different boroughs, like Prospect Park in Brooklyn is gorgeous. I love that place. But unless you're close to it, you're not gonna really experience it all the time. So it just depends on what neighborhood you're in. And if you're gonna be close to one of those big places, like in Chicago, it's the lakefront and Lincoln Park. So if you live in Lincoln Park or Old Town, maybe you'll be more nature focused by the lake, by the water, by the big greenery parks. And then in other neighborhoods, you might be close to a smaller park. Like I lived in Wicker Park in Chicago, so I was close to Wicker Park, but it's not like this huge greenery place with a lot of trees. It's like nice, like you have grass, you can go touch grass, but it's not a huge nature oasis like Central Park or Lincoln Park might be. And same here in Fidei, I'm close to different places that are really nice. I love walking on the West Side Highway and being by the water, and there's fun little parks where I can go touch grass, but I'm not immersed in the nature oasis that is Central Park. Chicago does have a more accessible beachfront because it's just right there downtown. There's a concrete beach though, which is just kind of funny, but there also is a sand beach. So Chicago does have that element, which is really cool. Versus New York, there are beachfronts, but you kind of have to get a bit out of Manhattan to go there. So like they're gonna be in Queens, or I think Coney Island maybe has something. So you kind of have to get a little bit more out of your way to get that beachfront feel in New York, which is another reason why I think a lot of people just at that point, they'd rather take a whole weekend trip and go somewhere else to get to the beach. But in Chicago, you really have the beach right there in the summer, which is nice. For both cities, you can really get that nature vibe if you're looking for it, but you do have to be intentional about living in a neighborhood that has easy access to those places if that's really important to you. Next question. I don't know why I said it like that. Sense of belonging in New York City versus Chicago. This question is so personal. I think it really just depends on you and what your values are and how you mesh with the personality of either Chicago or New York. I also think it really just comes down to the people that you know there. Yes, there is something to be said about the energy of the city, and when you're just out and about on your own, you can really feed off and feel if the energy of the city suits you. Like for me personally, I feel like the energy of Manhattan and the hustle and bustle and the overall just mentality of people here really resonates with me, and I feel that sense of belonging just from that. But even more so, I think it's more about the people that you actually know in those cities and the network and community that you have. So I think you can have a sense of belonging in both cities. I felt a ton of community when I lived in Chicago, and I had great connections with really cool people, and I loved the different memberships I was a part of there and my work culture. I really did feel like I belonged. But I just feel like I belong even more so in New York. And I think that comes down to just the closer friendships that I have here from college, and also just from having family that lives in the city. I have 2 cousins, a brother, a sister-in-law, my sister-in-law's sister, in terms of my family that live in the city. And I think that just makes such a big difference, just knowing that you have those people around you and having those connections, versus in Chicago, I didn't have any family ties and I had less close friendships in Chicago. I definitely had amazing girls that I was friends with there that I got super close with, but I did have a ton of long distance friends when I lived in Chicago, which could feel isolating at times if your whole friend group is in another city. So I think that's really just depends. I think you can find belonging in both cities. People that move to a big city, especially if you're in your 20s or 30s, people want to be out and about and have fun and meet people and go out and do things and explore. So if that's the vibe that you also have, you're gonna find your people, you're gonna hit it off with people and just have fun and have plenty of things to do. It's really just about what city makes the most sense for you in terms of your budget. I think that's a really huge thing that you have to be aware of. If you just love New York so much and your passion for that is going to help you thrive in New York without having a specific lifestyle, like living alone, but you're okay with that and you'd rather live in New York than Chicago, then New York is for you. Or if like your career, if you really want to pursue theater or something arts related, or even certain fields like investment banking, I mean, I don't know 100% what city is best for that, but I feel like it might be New York. I don't know, but just different fields in your career. That is what drives a lot of people to New York. And I think New York does have so many more career opportunities in a bunch of different fields that you might not get in Chicago. So that's a huge reason why people might feel a bigger sense of belonging in New York. Also, it's just so commonplace in New York to have different side hustles and just a bunch of different things going on. So if that's your energy, maybe you'll find that sense of belonging more so in New York, or if your industry or field is more prominent here, that might be more exciting for you and you might be willing to compromise on the lifestyle stuff, because for the same budget, if you are making the same exact salary, you will technically be able to afford a more luxurious or nicer lifestyle in Chicago in terms of getting a nicer apartment, etc. A thing I didn't talk about is my Chicago apartment. It was cheaper, obviously, but it also just had stunning natural light. In New York, that can be really hard to find without paying a pretty penny. So I mean, you can probably tell I have like a ring light right here. It's pretty dark in here. That's a huge thing. There's just so many factors about what is gonna work for you in your current lifestyle and goals and vision on whether Chicago or New York is gonna be the best place for you. So you just really have to think about it. But I hope this was helpful in giving more light to the situation on the different cities and how my experience has been living in both of them. I feel like I am thriving more in New York and I do feel more at home here, but I will always have a special place in my heart for Chicago. It truly was an amazing city to spend my first 3.5 years post-grad in. I learned so much. It's a beautiful place. There's so much to do and see, but I think at a certain point I did kind of outgrow it and I really was just gravitating towards wanting to move to New York, and I finally was able to fully support myself in that move from a financial standpoint and have the lifestyle that I wanted in New York City. So that ultimately led me to moving here, and I do just love it. And I feel like it's impossible to grow out of New York because there's just so much to do and see here, so many different neighborhoods to live in, and the city just does have so much to offer, but so does Chicago. It's just different things. I think that is it. Again, let me know if you have any more questions. I'm happy to answer them in the comments down below. Let me know where you live, if you're interested in moving to New York or Chicago, what neighborhoods you've lived in those cities. I'm so curious. It's always fun getting to hear from you guys and learn more about this community. I hope you guys liked this video. If you did, give it a thumbs up. It really helps my channel. And subscribe for new content. I post every Sunday and Wednesday. I've just been loving vlogging my life in New York for you guys, so it's been so fun. I will see you guys in the next video. Have a great rest of your day, whatever you're doing. I am just sending you so much positivity and joy. You got this, whatever you're doing. Bye.